the warm, cozy blanket channel. Today, as usual, I will tell you a nerve-tickling and imagination-stirring scary story in my cozy whisper. If you like what I'm doing, give this video a like and subscribe to my channel. Thank you warmly. Make yourself comfortable and I'll start the story. Creepy basement. The day my life turned into a nightmare. What could be better than summer? A carefree childhood, free from studies and other worries. The heat, the sun, playing football with friends in the yard. Cold ice cream melted in my mouth. It tasted like the most delicious, cold, incredible ice cream I had ever eaten. Of course, after another game of football, everything cold seems unforgettable and the most delicious thing in the world. It was already late outside. The sun was about to set, and with each minute it became redder and the clouds more colorful. I didn't want to do anything but watch as the sun grew darker and darker, sinking farther and farther away. "Anton," my mom shouted from the window of our small 5-story building. "Coming, Mom," I shouted back. How I didn't want to interrupt watching the sunset, but disobeying my mom wasn't an option. After saying goodbye to my friends, I trudged home with the ball under my arm. Approaching the entrance, I saw some grandmothers sitting and discussing something fervently among themselves. I had a good relationship with them. Sometimes I'd help them with something, other times just chat. Overall, I barely knew anyone from our building, nor did I particularly care about anyone's life. But I did know a few people from our building. Vidya from the first floor, my classmate. Aunt Luda, who lived across from us, who by the very distinct smells coming from her apartment, loved cats and baking. And also one old man whose name I didn't know, but often heard his name mentioned by the grandmothers on the bench, either Gennady or something similar, but he never seemed particularly interesting to me. In fact, I'd probably seen him only 2 or 3 times, and even then, from the window of my house late at night. Noticing the seated grandmothers, I decided to eavesdrop on their conversation. It was hard to hear, but they were again talking about Gennady. However, my reconnaissance didn't last long, as I saw my mom's silhouette from the window of my apartment with a disapproving look. After such a glance, I should have been home in a couple of seconds. Approaching the entrance, I greeted the grandmothers and went inside. Inside the building, everything was as usual: graffiti, various indecent drawings, and much more. Climbing up to my floor and entering the apartment, the smell of pancakes hit my nose, and upon entering the kitchen, I saw my mom cooking blinnies. "Where are you going with your shoes on? Take them off, wash your hands, and sit at the table. We'll drink tea," she said. The smell of pancakes overwhelmed my mind, and seeing a jar of condensed milk on the table, I quickly took off my shoes, washed my hands, and ran to the kitchen. But coming out of the bathroom, I bumped into my dad. "Whoa, whoa, whoa, take it easy, champ." Shaking hands with my father, we both went to the kitchen and sat down at the table. Late at night, when my parents went to sleep, I couldn't fall asleep. The cause of my insomnia was sounds coming from downstairs. Different gurgling noises, similar to someone squeezing slime or something similar. But at one moment, everything abruptly quieted down, and then I heard someone's door open, followed by the front door. My curiosity overcame all feelings in my body, and I got up to see who else was awake at such an hour. Approaching the window, I noticed the silhouette of a person, clearly elderly by their gait. To my surprise, he walked very slowly. I would even say he moved like a snail. He barely moved his legs. It seemed as if he was dragging them. He appeared to be heading towards our basement. Strange. Why would he go down to the basement at this hour? I thought to myself. Maybe for pickles, tinctures, various mushrooms. Soon, I got tired of watching this man and went back to sleep. In the morning, I woke up and completely forgot about the old man outside. After breakfast and getting ready to go out, I ran outside. Passing by the apartment from which unusual sounds came during the night, I smelled a moldy odor emanating from the same apartment. Covering my nose with my hand, I ran outside and breathed in the fresh air. After that, I immediately remembered the nighttime incident with the old man. I went towards the basement where the old man had gone. Approaching the basement, I noticed a pile of various trash, among which a cat's silhouette was visible. Oh God, I almost vomited at the sight. There lay a cat, already crawling with disgusting larvae, worms, and flies buzzing around. I looked a little more and noticed something green and gray on the cat. The feeling of disgust was very strong, but childish curiosity made itself known. I picked up a nearby stick and began poking the cat with it, moving all the larvae aside. Disgusting, squelching sounds filled my head, but after pushing aside enough larvae, I noticed something strange. Among all this horror, there was something resembling a mushroom, and from it sprouted even more smaller mushrooms. Oh my God, I said, covering my mouth with my hand. Nausea kicked in, and from the sight, I threw up everything I had eaten for breakfast. Leaving the poor kitty in the same spot, I went to the playground where my friends were already waiting for me. The day passed very quickly, but this whole time the picture I saw in the morning lingered in my head. On the way home, I saw Aunt Luda and other grandmothers sitting on the bench. Approaching closer, I saw a sad Aunt Luda and groaning grandmothers. Oh, what's happening, Lord? I only heard from there. Hello, what happened? I asked. Oh dear, I got up this morning, as always prepared bowls for my kitties. They all quickly ran up, but my Pusinka didn't come. At first, I thought she was still sleeping, started calling her, but no one came. I went outside, thinking maybe she fell out of the window or something, started looking for her, searched, and Aunt Luda couldn't finish and burst into tears. So that's whose cat it was, I thought to myself. I'm sorry for your loss, Aunt Luda. Realizing there was nothing more for me to do here, I entered the building, which smelled even worse than in the morning. Passing by the foul-smelling door, I noticed some mushrooms next to it, very similar to those on Pusinka. Unable to bear the stench, I ran to the apartment, opened the door, and rushed inside. Anton, my mother asked questioningly, why are you so early? Don't you feel like going out today? My mom asked, but I simply replied that I didn't feel like hanging out today. also smell something in the hallway?" I received an affirmative answer. Even this morning when I took out the trash, I almost puked from this smell. Maybe someone died, who knows? Ending our discussion, I went to my room, lay down on the bed, and just started staring at the ceiling, pondering what had happened. That night, I couldn't fall asleep, thinking about what could have caused this stench, and those gurgling sounds from below wouldn't let me sleep. But at one point, just like that night, they suddenly stopped, and I heard the opening of a door, then the front door. I rushed to the window, but the only thing I saw was something very fast, running on all fours. But I distinctly heard the basement door slam. Sleep vanished instantly, and I began waiting for whatever might happen. I stood and stared at the basement door. I don't know how long I waited, but my observation was interrupted by my father entering my room. "Why aren't you sleeping at this hour?" Rubbing his eyes and yawning, my father asked. Not coming up with anything better, I replied that I was watching the night nature. "Well, you're something. Isn't there anything else to do? Go to sleep right now." My father changed his tone. After that, I sadly lay on the bed and couldn't fall asleep for a long time. Waking up almost at noon, I went to the kitchen and saw strange things. The refrigerator was in the middle of the kitchen, and next to it, my father was tinkering with tools, while my mom was with rags and a bucket of water in the place where the fridge used to be. "Good morning. What happened?" Wishing me a good morning too, my mom showed me a dark green mold stain. Immediately, the smell of rot hit my nose, the source of which was in garbage bags. Everything rotted. Almost all the food spoiled and got covered in mold, my father told me. "Antosha, if it's not difficult, throw this trash away. Otherwise, we'll go crazy from this smell," my mom asked. And a few minutes later, I was on my way to the dumpster with a bag of rotten food and decay. Opening the door and passing by the apartment below, I saw that the door had turned pale green, and the number of mushrooms had increased many times. Reaching the dumpster and not vomiting, I decided to walk to the basement door. Approaching the basement, I noticed a huge amount of mushrooms, mold, and decay that had taken over almost the entire door. Looking down, I realized I had stepped on this substance. Yuck, what a disgusting mess. I shook off the green substance from my sneaker and went for a walk outside to clear my mind and forget about all the horrors. I wandered around until evening, and hunger forced me to return home. Approaching the entrance, I didn't notice Aunt Luda and the other grandmothers. This was very strange because they almost every day sat on the bench discussing everything and everyone, but today they weren't there at all. Entering the building and already automatically holding my nose, I began climbing to my floor. Reaching the floor with that particular apartment, I noticed those same grandmothers pinching their noses and knocking on the neighbor's door. Paying no attention to me, nor I to their presence. While climbing to my floor, I saw the same rot and mushrooms, but now in different places of the building. On the ceiling, in dark corners, on the walls, even showing up on neighboring doors. What kind of pestilence is this? These mushrooms spread with unbelievable speed. I was genuinely unsettled by all this spectacle. Entering the apartment, I saw this picture. Many wallpapers had peeled off. The entire apartment smelled of glue and paint, and my mom and dad sat in the kitchen talking about something, apparently about this infestation. Looking at them, I noticed something strange. They looked very tired and pale. "Mom, Dad, are you okay?" I asked them, to which I received the following response. "Antosha, everything's fine. Just me and your dad are a bit tired, probably inhaled this filth. Come sit at the table. We'll serve you some soup. You must be hungry," my mom said. And Dad didn't utter a word, just looked at my mom with sad, tired eyes. Mom took out a pot of soup we had prepared a few days before all this. I sat at the table and began eating the soup hungrily. I ate and ate, not noticing the strange taste. I was so hungry that I didn't even realize I had eaten the whole bowl. Putting the bowl on the table, I noticed something gray at the bottom. So that's what gave the soup such a taste: mold, gray-green mold. Upon realizing what I had seen, I immediately threw up on the spot where the mold stain had been earlier. What I had eaten was on the floor. Mom immediately went for rags and a bucket, and Dad apparently went to their room. I stood over all this substance I had vomited. But that wasn't the most disgusting part. The most disgusting was what I saw as worms crawled out of the wall, painted over with white paint. Disgusting, long, pale green worms crawled amidst my vomit and ate it. I couldn't look at all this and ran to my room, locking it. I sat on the bed and just collapsed to sleep in dirty clothes, unwashed, simply lay down and fell asleep. Late at night, I woke up to a certain feeling, as if someone was watching me. I opened my eyes, but there was no one in the room. I looked around, but there was no one in the room. Only the window was wide open, although I remembered it being closed, and no one could have entered the room. I approached the window to close it, already reaching for the handle, when I noticed something looking at me in the courtyard of our house, standing right under the window and staring at me with its small eyes. We stared at each other for a long time, or so it seemed to me. I tried to figure out what this something currently standing there was. Squinting slightly, I noticed how the creature moved its legs, like some kind of centipede. It moved its furry legs, and here I noticed movement towards the entrance. It still stared at me with its eyes. As soon as the creature crawled to the entrance door, in the light of the street lamp, I noticed that instead of eyes, there was some kind of slime from which worms crawled out, falling directly onto the asphalt. Watching all this action, I felt my stomach clench with cold, as if I was about to be grabbed by the shoulder. It became strangely quiet around, no wind noise, no usual creaking of the house. Only a soft, wet sound, like someone dragging a sack with something heavy, echoed from below. I couldn't tear my gaze away from this creature. It seemed as if it was looking at me even through the wall. And then its legs, those same furry, scurrying limbs, began to stretch out. They slowly stretched upwards, clinging to the wall of the house. Each of its jerks was accompanied by a disgusting slurping sound, and I noticed how the trail from its legs left behind a nasty, sticky liquid. I smelled it almost immediately, a rotten smell, saturated with decay, which made me want to pinch my nose. The creature was moving upwards towards my window. Panic overwhelmed me. My legs seemed glued to the floor. I could only watch as this something drew closer and closer. Another moment, and I discerned worms wriggling in its eyes, which now literally dripped down the wall of the house. My fingers trembled as I slowly reached for the window frame, trying to close it. But as soon as my hands touched the glass, the creature suddenly stopped. It seemed to have heard me. Its entire body, covered in clumps of dirt and slime, froze. Then I noticed how a long, thin tentacle-like limb emerged from one of its legs, which began tapping on the glass, quietly, rhythmically. But with each strike, the sound grew louder. I retreated, not daring to breathe. The last thing I saw before rushing out of the room was how the creature slowly extended one worm from its eye socket and, like a tentacle, began tracing the outlines of the window. It seemed to be trying to find a way to get inside. I ran out into the corridor and headed towards my parents' room. I started banging on the door with all my might, and soon under the door, I noticed the light turning on, and then I saw my sleepy, pale dad rubbing his eyes. "Anton, have you seen the time?" my father asked in a stern and tired tone, to which I gave incoherent explanations and attempts to lead him to the room. Somehow managing to bring him to my room and pointing to the open window with my finger, my father approached the window and, seemingly seeing nothing, came up to me and said, "Anton, you understand that monsters don't exist. There are no rotten centipedes." I looked towards the window and saw nothing and no one. I tried to say something, but my father wouldn't listen and went back to the room, slamming the door to my room beforehand. I couldn't have imagined this. I definitely saw it. And most importantly, I felt the smell of decay. I stood in the middle of the room and couldn't piece together a couple of thoughts. I couldn't process what had happened a few minutes ago for a long time. With these thoughts, I lay down to sleep, though I couldn't fall asleep, just lying on the bed and looking towards the window. Only towards morning did I manage to get some sleep. In the morning, I wanted only one thing: for this to have been just a nightmare. But opening my eyes, I realized that now the nightmare wasn't in my dream, but in the situation I found myself in. Going to the kitchen, I noticed the following picture. My dad was standing by the stove cooking. Noticing me, he pointed to the chair and served me his culinary creation. It seemed to be an omelet mixed with everything that was available. I picked up a fork and began eating it. It tasted mediocre. Apparently some products weren't fresh. With each bite, I distinguished more and more flavors: tomatoes, sausage, pepper. But there was something new this time. I glanced into the plate and saw something strange, like mushrooms. Strange. Mom and Dad don't like mushrooms. And where did they get them from? That's when it dawned on me. All this time, I had been eating those same mushrooms that grew in our house. I immediately turned pale and, holding back all urges to vomit, ran to the toilet. Running inside, I released everything I had just eaten. For several days in a row, I hardly ate, and if I did, the food immediately came back up. Raising my eyes, I saw a scary thing. All the walls were covered with these mushrooms, and some appeared freshly cut. Suddenly, someone knocked. "Hey kid, don't you like my dinner? If not, then then go wherever you want. I don't care." Was this my dad speaking? I can't believe it. He couldn't have said that to me. He was always kind. Coming out of the toilet and looking at him, I saw him baring his teeth and pointing me to the front door. Having no choice, I went to get dressed to go outside. Getting dressed, I noticed something strange on my dad's body, which scared me even more. From his body, I could see tiny, barely noticeable mushrooms, surrounded by some kind of substance resembling decay, but mixed with blood. Such a sight made me not want to return home at all. Honestly, I'm starting to get used to this smell in the hallway. I didn't want to go outside, so I decided to visit Aunt Luda. She would feed and water me. I rang the bell, but no one heard. I rang again, but the door remained unopened. This really scared me because Aunt Luda is always home in the morning and goes outside closer to lunchtime. "Aunt Luda, are you home?" I asked, but heard only silence in response. I decided to grab the handle and realized that the door was actually open. I slowly opened the door and called out, "Aunt Luda, your door is open. May I come in?" Without waiting for an answer, I went inside. Looking around, I saw the same picture as at home: rot, mold, peeling wallpaper. But something surprised me the most: a cat lying at the end of the hallway. I walked a little further. The farther I went, the stronger the stench became. Entering one of the rooms, I saw a horrifying scene. In the room was Aunt Luda, through whom a large mushroom had grown all the way to the ceiling. And next to her were all the cats, through whom mushrooms had also grown. This sight frightened me so much that I couldn't breathe for what felt like an eternity. Looking at all this horror, I realized that things were bad in this house. Poor Aunt Luda, she didn't deserve such a fate. Coming to my senses, I immediately ran to the exit, slammed the apartment door, and began ringing doorbells in neighboring apartments, but no one answered or opened the door. Reaching the floor where all this filth originated, I stopped at Gennedy's door and saw how his door had turned into a mixture of mushrooms, worms, and decay, emitting a foul odor. It looked very disgusting, and it smelled even worse, but I noticed something even scarier. This pestilence was spreading more and more. I literally saw its movement, how the walls began to be covered with decay, and how worms crawled in it. The scariest thing happened when the apartment door began to slowly open. I couldn't stand it and ran outside. Rushing into the yard, I noticed a certain substance near the entrance door from which mushrooms were growing. Mushrooms, 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 mushrooms. I couldn't think about anything other than mushrooms and decay. I ran to the guys playing football, but approaching them, they all pinched their noses and told me to go to hell. Not understanding why I deserved such treatment, I went back to the house. Approaching the entrance, I simply sat on the bench and did nothing. People passing by pointed fingers in my direction and pinched their noses, but I didn't care about anyone's opinion anymore. I was too tired from the past few days. With each minute, my eyelids grew heavier and heavier, and my eyes automatically closed, and I fell asleep. I dreamed of how this thing crawled into my room, killed my parents, and then crawled towards me and into my mouth. I woke up to something crawling all over me. I didn't immediately understand what it was, as soon as I looked closely, I noticed worms biting me and crawling all over my body. I immediately jumped up and started shaking them off, and some I had to rip off. Looking at the sky, I realized it was already late at night, and the light came from a small bulb on the entrance door. I stood a little longer and realized I needed to go home. Opening the door with a key, I entered the building, climbed up to my floor, and saw something. The neighbor's door was wide open. A sense of fear engulfed me, and I just stood frozen, unable to move. I heard numerous legs walking towards me, and a little more and I would have fainted. Here I noticed something crawling out of the apartment. It was Aunt Luda, but instead of legs and arms, she had the same small, furry legs as that creature. Behind her, I noticed something larger, surpassing Aunt Luda in size several times. At this sight, my head spun, and I began to lose consciousness, and the stench coming from them finished me off completely, and I lost consciousness. I don't know what they did to me, but I ended up in a dark, soft, and smelly room. The room was illuminated by dim moonlight coming through a window covered with some substance. It was almost impossible to see anything, but after a few minutes, I began to see more and more. By the outlines of the walls, I realized I was in the basement. I got up, wanting to look for an exit, when I heard something coming my way. I hid behind the nearest wall and began listening. A few seconds later, something big entered the room, emitting a foul odor. I looked closely and saw a large, I would even say huge spider, entirely covered in decay, mold, and mushrooms. A few seconds later, I heard it roar, apparently angered by the disappearance of one child. It began running around the room, and at that moment, I thought it was the end for me. But outside, I heard shouts and songs of people, clearly recognizable as local drunks. The spider shifted its attention to them and ran off in a few seconds. I quietly came out of hiding and began examining the basement and looking for an exit. The basement seemed completely covered in decay and mushrooms. Everything looked so damp and fragile, as if the entire basement would collapse at any moment. I continued searching for an exit and noticed light coming from an open door. I ran towards the door, but oh how lucky I was to bump into this spider, which carried the bodies of two drunks in its jaws. Noticing me, the beast screamed so loudly that my ears popped. The beast struck me with its leg, and I flew several meters, landing on a table and breaking it. I nearly lost consciousness again, but the will to live took over. I noticed how this beast placed the bodies of the drunks on the floor and began slowly approaching me. I saw how it prepared to run at me, but I wasn't ready to give up just yet. The beast roared and ran at me. I quickly reacted, grabbed a table leg, and as soon as the beast ran up to me, I thrust the sharp end of the table leg towards the beast. The beast didn't have time to react and impaled itself on the table leg. It roared with such power that I thought I would go deaf, and my ears would fill with blood. But there was no fear left in me, and I began pulling out and reinserting the table leg into this beast. Strike, another strike, and another and another and another and another and another and another. I hit and hit until this beast stopped breathing and showed no signs of life. I threw the table leg and just watched as this beast oozed decay. I watched and enjoyed the moment. Enough time passed, and I saw the sun beginning to illuminate the area. I exited the basement, covered in blood mixed with decay. Fresh air after so much time, I calmly went outside, approached the entrance door. Fortunately, the door was open, and I went inside. Climbing up to my floor, I saw what was left of Aunt Luda. The beast must have gotten hungry and devoured her. Standing for a little while and looking at this sight, I climbed to my floor and noticed that the door to our apartment was open. I went inside and saw this picture. All the hallways were covered in decay and mushrooms. Everywhere were worms, and in the door of my parents' room was a hole chewed by worms, through which I could see my sleeping parents. I entered and realized that my parents were no longer my parents. Noticing me, they fell to the floor and crawled towards me. In response, I simply closed the door and barricaded it with a chair. I heard their moans and how they tried to get out of the room. Saying goodbye to my parents, I entered my room, took off my shirt, looked in the mirror, stretched, smiled, and went to sleep, scratching the mushrooms growing out of my body. I didn't care what would happen to me anymore. I just wanted to lie down and sleep. Lie down and sleep.